Hello, welcome to the channel. Today we are going to talk about an enigmatic and fascinating character from the Bible, Enoch. In just 3 brief biblical passages, we find important pieces of Enoch's life story, as if they were parts of a puzzle. By putting them together, we can glimpse a unique man, dedicated and with a deep faith. Before we start, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive more content like this. Let's explore the story of Enoch together. Enoch is a biblical character with few mentions in the scriptures, but despite the brevity of the records, his life and actions carry extraordinary spiritual depth. It is important to clarify that we are not talking about Enoch, son of Cain, who appears shortly after Cain's exile and follows a very different context in the Bible. The Enoch that we will address here is part of another branch, a branch that carries with it a unique narrative, full of mysteries and revelations that go beyond its time. This Enoch that we highlight in biblical history is mentioned in the book of Genesis and in passages from the New Testament, including the letters of Hebrews and Jude. Its name has roots in Hebrew, derived from the word shanak, which can be translated as initiation or dedication. This meaning suggests that Enoch was not just someone who sought God, but someone deeply committed, consecrated to a life of faith and spiritual discipline. Its name reflects an existence marked by devotion and a singular purpose: to live a life that was in everything aligned with God's will. From an early age, Enoch stood out as someone with a special inclination towards the spiritual. Unlike the majority of his generation, who lived unrestrainedly and increasingly removed from divine values, he remained firm, seeking something beyond the material and ephemeral. The Bible does not tell us about the details of his youth, but we can imagine that from a young age he demonstrated an intense curiosity for spiritual matters, a deep desire to understand and get closer to the Creator. His exceptional character and spiritual quest denote that he was different from many around him. Enoch was born in the 7th generation from Adam, being part of the lineage of Seth. This point is especially significant in the Bible, as Seth was the son granted to Adam and Eve after the tragedy involving Cain and Abel. The name 7, which means replacement or compensation, symbolizes a reset for Adam and Eve, a son who represented hope and the continuity of the divine purpose for humanity. The offspring of Seth are seen as a lineage of men who maintained a reverence for justice and sought a deep relationship with God. Enoch, born into this lineage, inherited the legacy of faith and the search for righteousness that characterized this family. It is worth remembering that, at the time of Enoch, humanity still enjoyed exceptional longevity. People of that generation lived hundreds of years, which indicated traces of the original physical perfection that Adam and Eve possessed before the fall. However, despite longevity, the moral landscape was dark. The culture was deteriorating rapidly, with values and behaviors increasingly distant from ethics and reverence for the Creator. In this context of decadence and violence, Enoch's life shines as a contrast. A man who preferred holiness and truth in the midst of a generation dominated by corruption. Another point that makes Enoch fascinating is his prophetic position. Despite living in a troubled time, he is recognized for his closeness to God, something that made him mentioned as one of the first prophets. In the biblical texts, we see that his life was marked not only by personal devotion, but also by a responsibility to carry divine messages. His story raises questions. How did he manage to stand out in a time of so much ungodliness? What made him so close to God? Enoch's family life is an essential point in understanding his devotion and how he expressed his faith in all areas of his life, including his relationship with his wife and children. Enoch was married, although the Bible does not mention his wife's name nor the exact number of children they had. However, it is said that he fathered sons and daughters, which allows us to imagine a large family, something common at that time. Enoch's dedication to God spilled over into his home, where he assumed the role of spiritual leader, guiding his family to follow a life of righteousness and devotion, despite the deteriorating morals of the society around him. At that time, keeping a family together and centered on God's values was a real challenge. The scriptures indicate that violence and impiety had spread, especially among the descendants of Cain, who exalted violence as a symbol of power and pride. However, Enoch did not allow himself to be influenced by the hostile and corrupted environment. He was a living example for his family, not only because of what he said, but mainly because of the way he lived. His life was a reflection of his faith, and this coherence between faith and action inspired not only those around him, but also those who lived with him. As a father, Enoch seems to have taken the responsibility of teaching his children the way of justice, not as an imposed rule, but as a daily example. He guided them to seek intimacy with God, valuing the importance of a consecrated life. The Bible does not detail exactly the method with which Enoch taught his children, but knowing his character, we can imagine that his actions spoke as loudly as his words. He cultivated a living, practical, and constant faith, showing that communion with God should be the center of everything, including family relationships. In addition to spiritually leading his family, Enoch probably taught lessons about respect, discipline, and love, values that underlie a life guided by divine principles. His connection with God seemed to be so deep that he served as a source of inspiration and direction for everyone around him. We can imagine Enoch talking to his children about the creation of the world, about ancestors like Adam and Eve, and the importance of living in obedience to God, reminding them of the consequences of choosing the path of disobedience and pride, as had happened with Cain. Another interesting aspect of Enoch's family leadership is that he lived during a period of human longevity, where each family member could accompany entire generations. This scenario meant that Enoch not only influenced his children directly, but also grandchildren and possibly even great-grandchildren. His unshakable faith left deep marks on future generations, building a legacy of spirituality that would transcend his own life. Enoch's family did not live in isolation. They were inserted in a world where idolatry, violence, and corruption had taken over, but he strived to create a bubble of righteousness and worship of the true God. It was not an easy task, but Enoch remained firm, leading his family on the path of faith. He was, without a doubt, a pillar of faith amid the moral chaos of his time. His commitment to teaching and living according to divine laws is implicit, demonstrating how much he valued fidelity to his wife and dedicated himself to teaching his children about the true path, even without support from the social and spiritual context around him. Furthermore, by begetting Methuselah, Enoch ensured that his lineage would continue. Methuselah, known for his longevity, was the link that would connect future generations to his father's example. Enoch was like a spiritual anchor to Methuselah and his descendants, and this spiritual heritage probably continued to influence the family even after Enoch's disappearance. The culmination of Enoch's life is described in such a unique way that it generates admiration and, at the same time, profound questions. In the book of Genesis, chapter 5, we find the account of his life and the mystery surrounding his final destiny. The passage tells us that Enoch lived 65 years and then became the father of Methuselah. From then on, he walked with God for 300 years and had other sons and daughters, totaling a lifespan of 365 years. And then an intriguing statement ends his story. Enoch walked with God and disappeared because God took him to himself. This expression, walked with God, is loaded with meaning. It goes far beyond a simple description of your conduct. It represents a spiritual intimacy that transcended common religious practices. Unlike many biblical characters who follow faith trajectories with ups and downs, Enoch seems to have experienced a constant journey, marked by an intense and continuous closeness to God. He was not just a man who obeyed religious rules or followed formalities. He had an authentic, deep, and personal relationship with the Creator. The phrase, walked with God, reflects a communion of soul and spirit. It means not only recognizing the existence of God, but integrating that divine presence into every aspect of life. For Enoch, God was not a distant figure, but a constant companion. He lived in a state of full awareness of the divine presence, shaping his attitudes, his words, and even his thoughts. This walk with God can be compared to a daily journey, where every step, every choice, and every moment was shared and guided by the Creator. The term walking with God also suggests a relationship of trust and surrender. Enoch did not need visible proof to believe, nor earthly rewards to remain firm. He dedicated himself because he understood the intrinsic value of the divine presence in his life. In the midst of a corrupt society, which valued violence and pride, he decided to follow an opposite path, a path of peace and righteousness. This daily relationship brought him closer to a unique spiritual experience, an intimacy that few other biblical figures achieved. Enoch's life is not only notable for its longevity, but for the quality of his spiritual journey. The relationship he built with God was so deep that it seemed to transcend human limitations. He developed a spiritual affinity that went beyond religious formalities, becoming a true example of uninterrupted communion. Enoch's closeness to God was, in fact, a reflection of his character, his discipline, and his unbreakable desire to live to please the Creator. This walk with God culminates in one of the most extraordinary events in the Bible, the rapture of Enoch. Scripture says he disappeared because God took him to himself. This is no ordinary ending, for unlike all other human figures who have experienced the inevitable experience of death, Enoch is spared this fate. He didn't die. On the contrary, his connection with God reached such depth that he was taken directly into the divine presence. This rapture represents a unique and unparalleled reward, a manifestation of divine approval that further highlights the intensity of your relationship with God. What makes this passage even more intriguing is the fact that the Bible describes this event simply and directly, without details or explanations. There is no mention of an extraordinary ceremony or phenomenon accompanying Enoch's disappearance. The simplicity of the biblical statement contrasts with the magnitude of the event, suggesting that for God, this was a natural outcome for a man of such faith and dedication. God simply took him to himself, like a father taking back a beloved child. The comparison between Enoch and other biblical figures who also stood out for their closeness to God is inevitable. An example is the prophet Elijah, who, on a later occasion, was also caught up supernaturally. In the case of Elijah, the biblical narrative describes a spectacular departure with chariots of fire and a visible ascent to heaven. However, Enoch's departure is marked by a simplicity that does not diminish his greatness. On the contrary, this simplicity seems to underline the unique intimacy he enjoyed with God. History challenges us to reflect. How is our spiritual journey? Are we seeking authentic communion with God, like Enoch, or are we settling for superficial faith? Enoch's example reminds us that the greatest prize we can obtain is, in fact, the privilege of walking side by side with the Creator in every step of our lives. Another fascinating detail about Enoch appears in the letter of Jude, where he is described as one of the first prophets, standing out as someone who had a clear understanding of the future and divine purpose. According to Jude 1 verses 14 to 15, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of divine judgment, saying, "Behold, the Lord cometh with thousands upon thousands of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their wicked deeds which they have ungodly committed." This prophecy reveals the deep level of his connection with God, which not only preserved him from death, but enabled him to announce divine truths. Enoch's position as a prophet is an intriguing aspect of his life. He lived in a time when violence and corruption were increasingly prevalent, and his role as God's spokesman highlights how he differed from those around him. Enoch's message was clear and challenging. One day God would bring judgment on the wicked, judging their actions of disobedience and their lack of respect for divine holiness. This solemn warning may also have served as an attempt to awaken people to the need for change, encouraging them to turn away from sin and pursue lives of righteousness. It is interesting to note that Enoch was not just prophesying about the present, but about events of cosmic proportions, which, according to scholars, point to the distant future, encompassing the final era of divine judgment. This prophetic vision shows that Enoch was endowed with a spiritual perception that transcended his time, pointing to an event that to this day is part of the eschatological expectations of different religious traditions. His prophecy of final judgment continues to echo, reminding all who read these words of the importance of living in harmony with God's will. Enoch's prophecy, preserved in the letter of Jude, also suggests that he was not an isolated prophet but a spiritual leader, someone who proclaimed the truth to those around him and sought to warn his generation about the consequences of their actions. Although there are no additional details about how this message was received, it is possible to imagine the impact of a figure like Enoch on his society, which saw in him a man who truly walked with God. His prophecy was not just a prediction of future events, but a reflection of his own life dedicated to holiness and a warning about the cost of turning away from God. Over the centuries, the figure of Enoch generated an impressive literary and spiritual legacy. 3 books were attributed to him: the first, second, and third books of Enoch. Although these writings are not considered part of the canonical scriptures, they present themes and concepts that expand and deepen insight into Enoch's role in biblical history and spiritual traditions. These texts address complex themes such as apocalyptic visions, the rebellion of fallen angels, the final judgment, and a cosmology full of mysterious details. The first book of Enoch is the most extensive and well-known, preserved mainly by Ethiopian tradition and in parts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This book is a veritable treasure trove of apocalyptic ideas, detailing Enoch's visions of the end times and the fate of the righteous and the wicked. Additionally, he relates stories about fallen angels, called Watchers, who descended to earth and became involved with humans, resulting in a lineage of giants who brought even more destruction and corruption to the world. This narrative, in turn, connects with expectations of a final judgment, where God will correct the mistakes made and restore order. The second book of Enoch, preserved mainly in Old Slavonic and with some fragments in Greek, explores mystical and cosmological themes, including Enoch's heavenly ascensions and his revelations about the nature of the universe. This text describes in detail the various layers of heaven that Enoch visits, where he learns about the workings of the cosmos, God's justice, and the destinies of souls. The second book of Enoch offers an even more mystical view of his experience, revealing an Enoch who is elevated to unparalleled spiritual heights, where he testifies to truths that go beyond common understanding and human limitations. The third book of Enoch is less known, but is important for Jewish and Kabbalistic mystical traditions. This book is believed to have been written between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD, presenting Enoch as a cosmic sage and a figure who, after being taken to heaven, receives the title Metatron, the Prince of Angels. In this book, Enoch participates in dialogues with God and comes to occupy a special position in the celestial hierarchy, acting as an intermediary between the divine and the human. This figure of Enoch as Metatron strongly influenced Jewish mystical traditions, especially in Kabbalah, where he is seen as a powerful angelic entity close to God. Although these books are not officially recognized as part of the biblical canon, their influence over the centuries is notable. They have been preserved and studied in various religious and mystical communities, conveying an expanded view of Enoch's life and spiritual experiences. These texts offer a rich, detailed cosmology that complements and expands the canonical stories, providing in-depth perspective on topics such as the nature of good and evil, the importance of divine justice, and the role of angels in balancing the universe. Scholars suggest that although these books were probably not written by Enoch himself, they preserve oral traditions and spiritual reflections that may have originated in the time Enoch lived in the patriarchal period. The presence of these texts demonstrates how much his figure was respected and considered a model of holiness and wisdom, capable of inspiring apocalyptic and mystical writings for centuries. The story of Enoch is an invitation to reflection. In a world that often distracts us from what really matters, her example reminds us of the importance of nurturing our spiritual connection. Amid the challenges of everyday life, taking moments to seek this intimacy with something greater helps us find peace and fulfillment. Enoch, who walked with God through difficult times, inspires us to seek this spiritual renewal. This search, more than a religious practice, is an opportunity to rediscover meaning and purpose in our lives. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the story of Enoch, a character who inspires our own spiritual quest and shows us the power of true intimacy with the divine. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also share with friends who may be interested in this topic. And, of course, stay with us and click on one of the videos that will appear on the screen to continue this journey of discovery together. A big hug, and see you in the next video.